Okay, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts of cover crop management strategies on soil health. So what is soil health? Well, it's a collection of soil properties, including the soil physical properties, the soil biological, and the soil chemical properties. It's all those pieces put together that make up our soil health components. And so I'm going to go through a number of studies here that we're going to talk about different aspects of soil health and how the cover crop management strategy impacted that. So we want to overall further harness the benefits of soil ecosystem services in corn systems, while our ordinary business as usual practices, planting the cover crops in fall after grain harvest, typically we get very low biomass, we don't see a lot of effects. But if we can try some other strategies, such as terminating late or planting early, or even after corn silage with a winter hardy species, we may be able to get some of these other benefits, including forage or grazing options. So our first study that we're going to look at is a 4-year study where we planted cover crops. It was a rye cover crop, and then we had a cover crop mix that was rye, a brassica, hairy vetch, and we planted that into the standing crops, and then we compared that to a post-harvest or late October planted cover crops. And then we looked at the different soil properties, including compaction, soil structural quality, and organic matter. And in short, while we did see some impacts on compaction, this was at 3 sites, so we saw reductions in compaction at 2 sites, and we saw increases in our easy to degrade or microbial, you can kind of think of it as the microbial food source, organic matter, and then our structural quality at 1 site. But then we didn't see any effects on soil organic matter or soil organic carbon. I use those interchangeably after 4 years of cover crops. And a lot of that boils back to the size of, or the amount of biomass our cover crops produced. And in this photo here, this is what some of the cover crops looked like in the spring. There's not a lot of biomass there, and it's not real consistent when we early seeded. And so that's why we're not seeing as many effects on our soil properties or soil health parameters as we'd like, at least in this particular study. So, as I said, early planting generally reduced compaction, but minimal effects on the other soil properties due to that low biomass production. So, well, what about if we terminate the cover crops late, such as at primary crop planting or at corn planting? So this is a 6-year study where we're looking at no-till continuous corn for 6 years. We're terminating the cover crops early, about 2 to 3 weeks prior to planting, so our kind of business as usual. And then we're terminating late or at corn planting. And this actually has 2 sites, a rain-fed site that's just east of Lincoln here, and then an irrigated site near Clay Center. I'm focusing on the irrigated site just because we've had higher biomass production there, and we're able to see more effects on the soil parameters because of that higher biomass production. So here in this box here, we have our cover crop biomass yield, really low biomass yield for our early terminated cover crops. But look at our late terminated cover crops. We're up over 1/2 ton and anywhere up to even 2 tons per acre of biomass, which in my mind is great. Because we can do some other things with that, and I'll get to that a little later in my talk here. Penetration resistance, which is just a measure of compaction, no effect of the cover crops. But our soil structure, late terminated increased soil structure, and that's because it increased soil organic matter, but we had no effect on water infiltration or plant available water. And we had no effect on our corn yield in 4 out of the 6 years, which is very good. In only 2 years did we have yield drag because of the late termination. And that's just because the cover crops are using water and If it starts out a little bit dry, or we get a dry spell during critical times of crop development, we may see those yield drags. So again, terminating later at planting, we increase organic matter, we install irrigation compared to our traditional business as usual termination at before planting. All right, now what about if we, so these previous sites that I talked about, they're generally pretty high in organic matter, anywhere from 2 to 4% organic carbon. But what if we targeted sites that really needed cover crops that could really benefit from having those cover crops, such as a sloping site that's eroded or a sandy site that's low in organic matter? And so this is a study that we are doing at 2 sites, one that's sloping near Bruno and one that's sandy near Norfolk. And we're pre-harvest or early seeding those cover crops into the standing crops. And then we also have a post-harvest planted cover crop that's planted in about October. We do see some better biomass yield with the pre-harvest planting at both sites, but we aren't seeing any effects in terms of organic matter or aggregate size, even not a lot of an effect on nitrate concentration. And that's just because this is a fairly young study. It's only 4 years old. If you remember from my late termination study, which had pretty high and consistently high biomass production. So if we can get consistent biomass production in this 1 to 2 ton per acre, or even half a ton consistently, I think we can start to see changes in a lot of these soil properties, at least the ones that we're looking at here that change readily with management. And then in terms of corn and soybean yield in this system, in only 1 year and at 1 site did we see corn yield decrease with the use of the cover crops. So again, early planting about 1 month prior to harvest had minimal effects on soil health and crop yields. Just in general, that's because we haven't had consistently high biomass production and it's still a fairly young study. So lastly, I'm going to kind of wrap us back around to looking at some of the cover crop grazing, or here I'm starting off with corn silage. Here we had an irrigated site at North Platte, and you're going to see this site come up again with cover crop grazing. We had a lot of biomass production, roughly 7 tons per acre, but we saw no effect on our soil properties. And again, this site, it was only 3 years, and it still had fairly high organic matter for the area. And then we did not see any effect of cover crops on the corn silage yield. And again, rye, despite the high biomass production, following corn silage had no effects on soil health, likely due to a lot of site variability and then the short time frame. And the site did have consistently high biomass production. That photo that I had in the very beginning with the trailer full of biomass, that is from this particular site where we went and harvested some of it. Okay, so what do we do if we want to try and get some other services? Short-term impacts of cover crops are minimal. In the long term, it's going to depend on the biomass production. We need consistent high biomass production in order to get those effects on our soil health parameters. But so if we're getting at least somewhere in that ballpark of half a ton per acre of biomass, can we maybe get some other services? Like that North Platte site, we had over 3 tons of biomass. What else can we do with it? I mean, can we pull some other services without negative impacts to our soils or crop fields? So now I'm going to talk very briefly about grazing and haying cover crops and their effects on soils and crop yields. And so we were looking at 2 sites here. Here's our irrigated North Platte site coming back. And here's our site near Tecumseh. And fairly high biomass production. We saw some reductions in compaction or penetration resistance, but really no effect on water content at planting or aggregate size or organic matter and crop yields at this site. And that's partially because they had mainly winter kill species in their cover crop mix here at this site. At the irrigated North Platte site, very high biomass production with cereal rye. And part of that is because they did fertilize it in the fall. We did see reductions in water content if the cover crops missed, but that did not translate to effects on corn silage yield. And again, we didn't see any effects on some of these other soil health parameters, including organic matter, aggregation, and various compaction parameters. And what about if we hay cover crops? So that site at North Platte had a lot of biomass. What if we went through and hayed it? Would that affect the soils? We did a review. Mary was part of this review. And basically we found that harvesting cover crops from this worldwide review did not generally affect soil properties, crop yields, weed suppression ability, but those studies are relatively few. So if we can get the biomass and we leave a sufficient amount of stubble, we could potentially maintain our soil health while gaining some other soil services. And with that, I will open it up for questions on my talk.